right, now that we've established that North America was not really a new world, and now that we've had a look at some European history, it's time to bring in the colonists. Of course, before colonizers came to North America, there's a whole era of exploration and conquest, but you have a written lecture that covers that period, so I'm going to assume at this point that you're familiar with, or you're going to be familiar with, the whole exploration conquest period of the 1500s and early 1600s. That being said, we now shift to the colonization activities, and specifically to the colonization behavior that comes from Britain. Now, we're interested in Britain, obviously, because the United States is going to develop out of British colonies. So you want to know, what were the British doing in regards to colonizing the, quote, New World? And the answer is, initially, not a lot. In the 1500s, when Spain and France were starting to plant colonies and starting to get into North America, Britain was doing almost nothing, which is kind of odd because British interactions with this New World began early. The British first looked at the New World in 1497 when a merchant/contractor named John Cabot sailed west across the Atlantic from England and actually discovered North America. And our picture here shows the city where he got his funding for this. He sailed out of Bristol, England, and Bristol is one of these cities that, again, like Genoa, like Venice, was really into ocean sailing. In fact, Bristol sailors were really cutting edge in their own right. They had gone as far out as Iceland by the early 1200s. Cabot's kind of an interesting individual. We don't know a lot about him, but what we do know is really kind of strange. Cabot, before he sailed and discovered North America, he was a fairly well-traveled merchant around the Mediterranean region. He was a real estate speculator and a contractor. We also know he was very interested in sailing across the Atlantic and possibly finding a route to Asia. And there's been some speculation that he might have been along on Columbus's second voyage in 1493. What we do know for certain is that in 1494 he was in some trouble in Spain. This picture shows why. The picture here is Seville, Spain, and this actual bridge, or this bridge, is actually a bridge on the site where Cabot got into some trouble. See, back in 1494, Seville was trying to span this river. They wanted a bridge at this location to cross the river and connect to that island area out there, that neighborhood across the river, and they were going to use this bridge for trade. So Cabot contracted with the Spanish government to fix the kind of floating temporary bridge Seville had in this place and put something permanent with brick and mortar. And he didn't do it. He took the money, but he didn't build the bridge. So he was in trouble in 1494. There was talk about arresting him, and we know that he left Spain. Now, why he left Spain with the bridge money isn't clear, but it seems that what he was trying to do was somehow get himself a voyage across the Atlantic to go and find a route to Asia. Now, when he destroyed the bridge project, or when he left the bridge project, he ended up in Portugal, and there he heard about a plan to sail west across the northern Atlantic to see if that might be a shorter way to Asia. Apparently there were some Germans in Portugal trying to drum up some interest in the northern route, and Cabot apparently heard about it. Now, why Northern Europe? Why this new route? Well, because the Earth is a sphere. And navigation science, by the end of the 1400s, had discovered that the farther north you went above the equator, the smaller the distance you had to travel to go around the world. So this northern route had been discussed for years as a possible shortcut to Asia. Cabot heard about it, and then he went up to King Henry VII of Britain, who was looking to get his country over to Asia if possible, just like everybody else. Now, why go to Britain? I mean, that kind of puzzled me, as why a guy from the Mediterranean region would end up in Britain. But you find out that Britain was looking for sailors, and people who were willing to go out into the Atlantic were not that common, so they were looking for somebody. And if you were from Genoa, because of Columbus's success, you'd be respected. Also, that's the only place Cabot could find enough funding. Spain was contracted with Columbus, tied up with him. Portugal signed a treaty in 1494, leaving pretty much the western Atlantic Ocean to Spain. So if you wanted funding for a transatlantic voyage, Britain was pretty much all that was left. So Cabot went up there and he generated a lot of notice when he arrived. He came and he spoke to the English court and generated this huge paper trail as every diplomat up there reported there's a Genoese up here talking to the king about sailing west. Now, we don't know what Cabot said, but we do know is that King Henry VII agreed to pay for the voyage. And Cabot got funding down in Bristol, and he sailed away in 1497. So Cabot discovered North America and claimed the whole thing for Britain, and that's where it gets interesting. See, Britain had this gigantic land claim, and once they figured out this was in Asia, which they would, they could have just flooded the continent with colonies. I mean, think of the riches and the power they might have realized. But they didn't. British colonization really didn't start until the 1600s, and by that time, the only thing left in North America was the seacoast. By the 1600s, France and Holland and Spain and a couple other nations had already chopped into North America pretty thoroughly, so the 13 British colonies would be up and down the Atlantic coast, which everybody thought was the least valuable part of the continent. So why did Britain wait? And the answer to this question is more complex than most people realize. See, you have to think, what conditions are necessary for colonization? I mean, you talk about colonizing a new world, colonizing a planet for that matter. What do you have to have in place in your culture to do it? You need to have boatloads of money, motivation, and certain cultural mandates. You have to have an aggressive culture to be a colonizer, a culture that's aggressive and shares a unified vision of colonization. Now, did Britain have these conditions in the 1500s? No. In the 1500s, Britain had too many distractions. The 1400s and 1500s in Britain were times of extreme war and religious problems. Now, don't underestimate these things. One of the conflicts that Britain was going through, the 100 Years' War, was a 100 Years' War, and it lasted until the mid-1400s. So that war took some getting over. In the 1500s, which is called the Tudor period, there were religious problems that were time and money consuming. These problems stemmed from King Henry VIII's decision to reject Catholicism. Now, Britain had been a very Catholic country, so when Henry took away the church's authority in 1534, there were a whole bunch of complex issues that rose up. The whole Catholic infrastructure had to be dealt with. When you think about it, the Catholic Church had monasteries, nunneries, churches, offices. There were over 900 buildings in Britain associated with the Catholic Church. All of them had to be repurposed, reassigned, released to new people. Plus, when Britain turned Protestant, this generated some other problems as well. One of Britain's best friends was Spain. And when Britain turned Protestant, Spain became their biggest enemy. Spain had a huge presence on the Atlantic Ocean by the 1500s. So with Spain as your enemy, sailing to North America and planting colonies there risked war. And with all the internal problems Britain was going through, taking on a war with a major sailing power was just out of the question in the 1500s. And then there's this issue as well, the North Atlantic Ocean. This itself played a role in hindering British colonization efforts. You see, again, your big sailing nations of the 1400s and 1500s were on or near the Mediterranean Sea. That would be Venice, Genoa, Spain, Portugal. These places got very good at sailing, but for a reason. I mean, they're sitting on a relatively warm water sea, and they're able to practice their sailing in a somewhat gentle environment. The North Atlantic, which surrounds Britain, is a very different type of ocean. If you're planning on doing a lot of sailing up there, it would mean a huge technological outlay, which is what Bristol was doing. It would mean money and government support and technology to handle this really dangerous ocean. And you know, countries only have so much money and so much time. I mean, you can invest all your dollars in learning to sail on this ocean, or you can develop internal industries in, say, wool or something like that. You can master the North Atlantic, or you can repurpose the Catholic Church. You don't have unlimited money and time to do both. So when you factor the North Atlantic into the already complex situation at home, it starts to make sense why Britain didn't rush into colonization in the 1500s. And there's one other thing. I mean, if you really want to get into advanced historical thinking, you might want to consider the delay in British colonization from a different perspective. You might want to come at the question backwards, and this is a fairly common historical tactic. Instead of asking why Britain delayed colonization while Spain and Portugal and France rushed ahead, why not ask yourself, why did Spain colonize so quickly? Why did Portugal colonize so quickly, and to an extent France? Why were these countries so aggressive? Is rapid colonization and conquest the default norm for humans? Is that what we just expect from all cultures? Or is delay a more cautious approach? Is that normal? Now, when you start looking at colonization backwards like this, you get all kinds of interesting insights. And let's take Spain, for example, because that's your primary colonizer of the 1500s. Spain didn't start conquering and colonizing and taking over other worlds out of nowhere. It turns out, in the late 1400s, in 1492 exactly, Spain had just ended 700 years of conflict that we call the Reconquista. And the Reconquista, or the Reconquest, was the battle between Islamic and Christian people for control of the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is the modern nation of Spain. Now, this reconquest ended in a Christian victory in 1492. That year, Islamic people, as well as Jewish people, were told convert or leave, and the reconquest came to an end. And Portugal also had a reconquest of its own. But the point of this is that Columbus's 1492 voyage of discovery and the subsequent Spanish conquest activity didn't come out of nowhere. It came after centuries and centuries of reconquest behavior. Columbus sailed at a time when the Spanish mentality centered on conquering, capturing, and taking over. 700 years of conflict will put you in that kind of a mentality. So it was this mentality, in part, that fueled Spain's support of Columbus. I mean, Columbus was sailing to potentially new worlds, new places to conquer. Spanish empire building, that desire to conquer and colonize, is reconquest behavior. So we can talk about the reasons why Britain didn't rush into colonization, but be careful that you don't assume that rushing into colonization is normal in Europe. The only reason Spain, and Portugal for that matter, was being so aggressive is because that's where their culture was in 1492. This reconquest is a very big deal, and it has implications that extend all the way to the United States. Now, you all know that when Columbus came to the New World, he enslaved natives really without thinking. He just kind of did it automatically. And we also know that Spain and Portugal were the first to enslave Africans, and they seem to have done so without much thinking about it. They just kind of did so automatically, and then they exported Africans to the New World when natives died of disease. Did you ever wonder about that? I mean, did you ever wonder about why these cultures enslaved so easily and so readily? And it goes back to the Reconquest. In the Reconquest, slavery was part of the deal. In the Reconquest, you had 700 years teaching you that people who weren't Christians were different and could be conquered and needed to be conquered and controlled. The Reconquest involved enslaving non-Christians, so that by the time Columbus sailed in 1492, slavery was so fully integrated into Spanish and Portuguese culture that it was almost an afterthought. And both of these nations brought that mentality to the Western Hemisphere, where slavery became ensconced, and it spread to other nations, including Britain, whose colonies became, part of the New World. Again, as this picture says, don't underestimate this Spanish slavery in the, quote, pre-African era, that is, the era before African slavery. It's rather important that this come out. You see that island of Majorca there? This was an Islamic island, and it was conquered as part of the Reconquest. It was conquered by Christians in the early 1200s. After this island was taken, about 40,000 Islamic inhabitants were taken and sold as slaves in southern Europe. They were sent to Spain, what would be modern Spain, parts of southern France, and parts of Italy as well. So when African slavery shows up, it simply adds another group of people to an already intense amount of slavery in southern Europe. But let's go back to Britain. So without a reconquest behind them, without a cultural mandate that involved colonization and conquering and controlling, with a lot of internal problems and internal complexities, Britain didn't jump to colonization quickly. But that's not to say that they utterly ignored the New World. I mean, there were promoters in Britain who were interested in North America, and they thought about it for a variety of reasons. I mean, some thought this might be a place where British pirates could operate some bases. Britain did a lot of pirate activity, preying on Spanish treasure ships that were coming out of Mexico, and some British people promoted the New World and said we could have some bases there. They also thought it might be a really good place to spread Protestantism in the fight against Catholicism. And in the 1500s, there were several British explorers who actually sailed west across the North Atlantic, and they headed for what would be modern Canada, to the place we call Newfoundland today. These explorers tended to be rich, relatively inexperienced. Most of their names are not well known in history. One of them is Richard Hoare, and his expedition got to Newfoundland and ran out of food and ended up in cannibalism in 1536. There were some other crossings as well made by John Restell and Sir Humphrey Gilbert in the 1570s. A pirate named Sir Francis Drake actually made it all the way around the world between 1577 and 1580. There were some people mounting expeditions to look for gold. Some British people got into the sailing business to transport slaves to Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, and there was a lot of fishing. Pretty much everybody in Europe, once the New World was discovered, came and fished off the North American coast. In fact, it got to the point that some coastal regions became really international. Fishing was a huge big deal. It helped feed Spain's growing New World empire, and the Catholic Church was obeying fish on Friday back at the time, so there was a huge demand for fish. So Britain was involved in all this. They were doing some exploring, they were fishing, they were examining, they were looking for potential pirate bases. They just weren't conquesting and colonizing. That type of activity would start in the late 1500s, as concerns began to grow about Spain's wealth and power. Spain was a really scary rival, getting scarier by the years. It was an aggressive Catholic nation with an outspoken desire to spread Catholicism across Europe. It was a potential threat to Britain, which was a Protestant nation. And as Spain got richer and richer from its New World empire, Britain got to thinking, how big of an army or a navy could these guys build? And Britain got increasingly concerned. The individual in Britain who would take that country into colonization was Queen Elizabeth I. Now, she was Henry VIII's daughter, and she took the throne in the mid-1500s, right as the threat from Spain was rising. She's the monarch who will begin the British colonization process. Now, for our purposes, our modern state of Virginia is named for her, as her colonizers had a tendency to name the lands that they discovered for their queen. And they called Queen Elizabeth the Virgin Queen because she was never married, so they called the land Virginia after the Virgin Queen. Now, the land of Virginia will eventually coalesce into the colony of Virginia and eventually the state of Virginia, which will be the birthplace of our Civil War. So, in a kind of a weird way, you could say that our Civil War began in a place named for the sexual habits of a woman who died in 1603, because history can be weird that way sometimes. Now, we won't go into all the details about how British colonization started. Let's just say here that the first colonial venture sponsored by the Queen was in 1584 on the island called Roanoke off the coast of modern North Carolina. Now, this colony was the brainchild of Sir Walter Raleigh, who kind of just sort of Prince Henry'd this into existence. Now, Raleigh, at the time, was the favorite of Queen Elizabeth's. In the 1580s, she was his guy. She gave him all kinds of prizes, even gave him a manor house in London called Durham House, which he used as a center for colonial planning. See, Raleigh was just really into colonization and sailing across the Atlantic. So Durham House became like Prince Henry's old navigation school. Like-minded people would gather there to study navigation and sailing, to study maps, and to write propaganda in support of colonization. And Raleigh started planning for a colony in the southern part of North America, down near Florida. Raleigh was really into this. He was the half-brother of Humphrey Gilbert, who was one of Britain's explorers back in the 1500s. He'd actually joined Gilbert on one of Gilbert's voyages across the Atlantic. They did have to turn back, but Raleigh had already tried it once. He wanted to get into the New World. So his dream was to set up a colony that could start British colonization in the New World and also serve as a base for ships to go out and attack the Spanish treasure fleets. Now, after a kind of an exploratory voyage in 1584, Raleigh sent about 100 men to plant a colony on Roanoke Island between the Outer Banks of North Carolina and the North Carolina mainland. Now, these 100 men or so arrived in 1585, and they began exploring the North Carolina mainland, what would be North Carolina today. They were there for about a year or so, and here we have a picture showing Roanoke Island, right behind the Outer Banks, just off the coast of what would be North Carolina. So all the land you see here was thoroughly explored by the 1585 colonists. The problem was, as they explored, they got kind of haughty with the local Indians, who didn't appreciate that, and marched around, disrupted life and such, and started to turn the Indians against them. So they started facing supply problems, Indian problems, and they weren't really happy with their situation when Sir Francis Drake showed up in 1586. Now, Drake had this heavily armed pirate fleet that he went around with. He and Raleigh knew each other, so he was going to check in on the colony and maybe resupply them on his way back to Britain. And when Drake showed up with this fleet of pirate ships, the colonists just kind of abruptly decided to leave. They said, just take us home. We don't want to be here anymore. So in 1586, they left, went back to Britain, and Raleigh was really unhappy that his colony returned. They weren't supposed to do that. So immediately he started planning another one. And this time he got John White to lead it up. Now, John White was kind of a member of Raleigh's entourage, because Raleigh was like a celebrity. He went around with groups of people following him at all times. I mean, he was the Queen's favorite. So White was in the entourage, and White had been on the 1585 colony venture, and he was eager. He said, I'll take the next one, and he started recruiting colonists. Now, White got about 110 men, women, and children to go with him. This was going to be a permanent colony, and he mostly recruited them from his extended family. Now, July 22nd, 1587, the colonists arrived back on Roanoke Island. John White was their governor, and his daughter and her husband were among the settlers, so far so good. These people, though, would become one of the biggest mysteries in American history. They'd become the famous lost colonists of Roanoke. Now, the whole thing in 1587 kind of went bad from the start. The colony itself isn't that exciting. The colony was never supposed to stay on Roanoke Island. They came here largely just to pick up a handful of men who'd stayed behind to hold the island and hold on to the little fort that they had there. They were going to stop here, pick up any men who survived, and head up to the Chesapeake Bay to create their permanent colony. The privateer that carried them over, though, abandoned them here on Roanoke. You see, the privateers, they were the only ones going out on the ocean typically. Their interest was going down to raid the Spanish treasure ships. So their thought was, we're just going to drop these guys off and we're going to go. John White apparently wasn't strong enough to argue with the privateer captain and say, no, you have to stay and load us back on and take us up to the Chesapeake. He couldn't prevail. So the colonists got dumped on Roanoke Island, which was terrifying. This is a small island. They were put here without, proper supplies. Planting season was over. There was no food on this island, and they were terrified. The ship unloaded them for about a month. August 18th, 1587, the first British child born in North America was born. It was actually John White's granddaughter named Virginia Dare. But even though there were children and babies, the privateer still said, no, we're leaving you, and they left. So the colony was in a panic. They needed help. They needed supplies, food, they needed a ship to come and move them off Roanoke. So when the privateer left, they told John White, go with it, go back to Britain and talk to Raleigh. They figured White and Raleigh were tight, they knew each other, they were friends. White stood the best chance of getting Raleigh some help. He didn't want to leave, and in fact, it's a very touching moment when he did, that he said his daughter waded out in the surf and held up the baby, and they were all crying, but he got back on the ship and he left to go back to Britain. And before he left, he told the colonists, tell me where you're going to be. He figured they were leaving. I mean, nobody's going to stay on Roanoke Island. It just wasn't worth it. He figured they were leaving, and they actually had a ship with them that could cross over to the North Carolina mainland. He said, I know you're leaving, so when you go, carve a place on a tree and tell me the name of where you've gone. And he said, and if you're in danger, carve 2 very specific looking crosses next to the name, and I'll know you left in danger. You're in trouble. But tell me where you're going, and I will come and find you. So that was his last order. Just give me some kind of forwarding address. Now, most people know what happened next. Most people are pretty familiar with this story. Most people know White goes back to Britain, and then he couldn't get back to the colony quickly. He thought he'd go, talk to Raleigh, and come right back, but it didn't happen that way. The war that had been threatening with Spain for all those years finally happened. When he got back to Britain, Queen Elizabeth was building everything she could to defend her island from the super rich Spain that was coming, and she wouldn't release any ships that were big to go back across the ocean. She said, I need you here. And, White tried to get a couple small ships to take him back, but they didn't make it. Plus, he also found that Raleigh was no longer that interested in the colony. Raleigh had problems of his own all of a sudden. There was another guy moving in on Queen Elizabeth. He was losing his favorite status. So White found himself without a lot of help, and he did a lot of fundraising work and helped the colony work on his own. He had to wait, too, until Queen Elizabeth would release a large enough ship. So finally, in 1590, after the threat from Spain was over and Queen Elizabeth said people could go back out on the ocean, here's White frantically looking around for anybody to help his colony. But at that time, anybody who had a ship that could cross the ocean wanted to get back into the pirate trade and go make some money. Nobody wanted to take White to a colony and carry supplies. They wanted to get back in the game. So in March of 1590, he did find a group of privateers that were just pretty much willing to drop him off, and he sailed back to North America. And this is where the story gets weird. White kept a journal of this voyage, and he talked about exactly what happened. And basically, we have some of his words here, but the story goes that the privateer took him back to Roanoke Island, and as they approached the island, and it's kind of a dangerous place to sail, but as they came in, being as careful as they could, a great smoke went up from a nearby island. But when they went to investigate it, they didn't find anybody there. He said, so then they sailed up to Roanoke, and again, this is harder to do than you'd think. They sailed up to Roanoke, and he said that they came at night, and they came to the spot on the island where he'd left the colony, and they could hear people walking on the shore in the darkness. He said, so we called out to them in voices fair, and played trumpets, and hallooed to them and such, but no one answered. And he said the next morning, they came ashore and they were moving through the woods to go to the colony site because they left the colonists with things to build a little town with and such. And he said, we went to the colony site and we found carved on a tree 3 letters CRO, but that didn't make any sense. And then he said, when we actually got to the site where the colony was, it was just gone. I mean, it had vanished, but it vanished kind of weird. There was some kind of strong palisade built. He said it was the place where the colony had been, the houses taken down, and a very strongly enclosed with a high palisade of great trees. He said that a very fort-like structure. He said, and that hadn't been there when he left. He didn't know what it was for. There was no evidence of war or violence, no skeletons, no burns, nothing, just this very strong palisade. And at one of the posts at the entrance, he said the bark was taken off, and 5 feet from the ground, in fair capital letters, was graven Croatan, without any cross or sign of distress. And this done, he said, we looked at this, we entered the palisade, we found many bars of iron, 2 pigs of lead, 4 iron fowlers, and such heavy things thrown here and there, and overgrown with grass and weeds. But he said, of the colonists, we could find nothing of them. No furniture, no nails, no building materials, no shoes, no garbage. Absolutely nothing. And that's what makes this so weird, is that clearly they left, but they didn't leave a clear sign where they were going, and they didn't leave anything. They didn't leave a single thing behind that was of any use to anyone. Now, the lost colony is kind of creepy. I mean, we know they left, but the problem is they've never been found. When people move 110 individuals, or when you move a whole town across an area, you leave an archaeological trace. I mean, we can follow armies that marched thousands of years ago because of the archaeological traces they leave behind. You can identify battle sites because of the traces. Heck, people have even found the original glass beads that Columbus took in 1492 to give the natives. Those beads have been found on the islands that he visited. So the problem with the lost colony is we've never found anything from these guys. You'd think a whole town moving would leave behind a ring, or a shoe, or a buckle, or a gun, or some pots and pans, or some nails. There should be a lot of this stuff, and there's nothing. Now, that bothered White back in the day. In fact, he was really disturbed by this. He went to the end of his life wondering what in the world happened to that colony. Where did it go? Where did my daughter go? Where did my granddaughter go? Where did my extended family go? Apparently, he never got over it. And Britain really never did either. Britain searched for these people back in the 1600s. Raleigh tried to send expeditions to find them and failed. Even in the 1600s, in the 1700s, people were still wondering, where are the lost colonists? In fact, people used to go and poke around in the lost colony site at Roanoke all the time, looking for some kind of hints about what might have happened. That was kind of the thing people did back in the 1700s. Now, recent archaeological expeditions have found some artifacts, and part of the problem is coastal erosion has taken the site away, but there's still to this day no real sense of what might have happened to these guys. Now, what did happen to them? I don't know. Nobody knows. In the 23 to 24 years I've been teaching this subject, I've seen theories come and go and come and go. Every 10 years or so, someone claims to have discovered or solved the lost colony mystery. There's a new artifact found in an archive, or a new map is discovered or something, and it's been solved. But it never has been, really. The theories are the Native Americans say that the lost colonists simply blended into their tribes, they ran out of food, and they had no choice but to become Indians. And that's especially among the coastal tribes are the ones who make that claim the strongest, that the colonists are our ancestors. But there are a number of tribes in the interior of North Carolina who also make that claim. The Jamestown colonists in 1607 were told to ask about it, to see if they could figure out where are the colonists. And they were told a bunch of different stories. They asked the natives, and they were told that some of them died up on the Chesapeake Bay, that some of them died in Virginia, some died in North Carolina. There are a whole bunch of different Indian massacre allegations. There's speculation that they moved inland to the area around Edenton, and that floods and erosion took all the artifacts or something like that. There are maps that show forts that they might have gone to. There are sightings of blue-eyed and gray-eyed Indians in North Carolina. There's all kinds of things. But none of these explanations have ever really panned out. The honest truth is we have no idea where these people went. We have zero evidence that they went anywhere at all. I mean, we don't even know that they ever left Roanoke Island. So it's funny that where people live normally today in North Carolina and on Roanoke was one of the eeriest, creepiest places back in the 1600s. People didn't want to go in there because the lost colonists vanished in that area. And this vanished colony actually played a role in delaying English colonization activities, because after these people just vanished off the face of the earth, Britain didn't try again for about 20 years. And we'll pick up that story in the next lecture.